They rode on into the mountains, and their way took them through high pine forest, wind in the trees, lonely bird calls. The shoeless mules slaloming through the dry grass and pine needles. In the blue coulees on the north slopes, narrow tailings of old snow. They rode up switchbacks through a lonely aspen wood where the fallen leaves lay like golden disklets in the damp black trail. The leaves shifted in a million spangles down the pale corridors, and Glanton took one and turned it like a tiny fan by its stem, and held it and let it fall, and its perfection was not lost on him. Their way now led through a dwarf oak and ilex, and over a stony ground where black trees stood footed in the seams on the slopes. They rode through sunlight and high grass, and in the late afternoon they came out upon an escarpment that seemed to rim the known world. Below them in the paling light smoldered the plains of San Agustin, stretching away to the northeast, the earth floating off in a long curve, silent under the looms of smoke from the underground coal deposits burning there 1,000 years. The horses picked their way along the rim with care, and the riders cast varied glances out upon that ancient and naked land. In the days to come, they would ride up through a country where the rocks would cook the flesh from your hand, and where other than rock nothing was. They rode in a narrow enfilade along a trail strewn with the dry round turds of goats, and they rode with their faces averted from the rock wall and the bake oven air which it rebated. The slant black shapes of the mounted men stenciled across the stone, with a definition austere and implacable, like shapes capable of violating their covenant with the flesh that authored them and continuing autonomous across the naked rock without reference to sun or man or God. They rode down from this country through a deep gorge, clattering over the stones, rifts of cool blue shade. In the dry sand of the arroyo floor, old bones and broken shapes of painted pottery, and graven on the rocks above them, pictographs of horse and cougar and turtle, and the mounted Spaniards, helmeted and bucklered and contemptuous of stone and silence and time itself. Lodged in faults and crevices 100 feet above them were nests of straw and jetsam from old high waters, and the riders could hear the mutter of thunder in some nameless distance, and they kept watch on the narrow shape of sky overhead for any darkness of impending rain. Threading the canyon's close-pressed flanks, the dry white rocks of the dead river floor, round and smooth as arcane eggs. The moon rose full over the canyon, and there was stark silence in the little valley. It may be it was their own shadows kept the coyotes from abroad, for there was no sound of them, or wind or bird in that place, but only the light rill of water running over the sand in the dark below their fires. The judge all day had made small forays among the rocks of the gorge through which they'd passed, and now at the fire he spread part of a wagon sheet on the ground and was sorting out his finds and arranging them before him. In his lap he held the leather ledger book, and he took up each piece, flint or potsherd or tool of bone, and deftly sketched it into the book. He sketched with a practiced ease, and there was no wrinkling of that bald brow or pursing of those oddly childish lips. His fingers traced the impression of old willow wicker on a piece of pottery clay, and he put this into his book with nice shadings and economy of pencil strokes. He is a draftsman as he is other things, well sufficient to the task. He looks up from time to time at the fire, or at his companions in arms, or at the night beyond. Lastly, he set before him the footpiece from a suit of armor hammered out in a shop in Toledo 3 centuries before, a small steel tapadero, frail and shelled with rot. This the judge sketched in profile and in perspective, citing the dimensions in his neat script, making marginal notes. Glanton watched him. When he had done, he took up the little foot guard and turned it in his hand and studied it again, and then he crushed it into a ball of foil and pitched it into the fire. He gathered up the other artifacts and cast them also into the fire, and he shook out the wagon sheet and folded it away among his possibles together with the notebook. Then he sat with his hands cupped in his lap, and he seemed much satisfied with the world, as if his counsel had been sought at its creation. A Tennessean named Webster had been watching him, and he asked the judge what he aimed to do with those notes and sketches, and the judge smiled and said that it was his intention to expunge them from the memory of man. Webster smiled and the judge laughed. Webster regarded him with one eye asquint, and he said, "Well, you've been a draftsman somewheres, and them pictures is like enough the things themselves. But no man can put all the world in a book, no more than everything drawed in a book is so." "Well said, Marcus," spoke the judge. "But don't draw me," said Webster, "for I don't want in your book." "My book or some other book," said the judge. "What is to be deviates no jot from the book wherein it's writ. How could it? It would be a false book, and a false book is no book at all. You're a formidable riddler, and I'll not match words with you. Only save my crusted mug from out your ledger there, for I'd not have it shown about perhaps to strangers." The judge smiled. "Whether in my book or not, every man is tabernacled in every other, and he in exchange, and so on, in an endless complexity of being and witness to the uttermost edge of the world." "What is true of one man," said the judge, "is true of many. The people who once lived here are called the Anasazi, the old ones. They quit these parts, routed by drought or disease or by wandering bands of marauders, quit these parts ages since, and of them there is no memory. They are rumors and ghosts in this land, and they are much revered. The tools, the art, the building, these things stand in judgment on the latter races. Yet there is nothing for them to grapple with. The old ones are gone, like phantoms, and the savages wander these canyons to the sound of an ancient laughter. In their crude huts they crouch in darkness and listen to the fear seeping out of the rock. All progressions from a higher to a lower order are marked by ruins, land, mystery, and a residue of nameless rage. So, here are the dead fathers. Their spirit is entombed in the stone. It lies upon the land with the same weight and the same ubiquity. For whoever makes a shelter of reeds and hides has joined his spirit to the common destiny of creatures, and he will subside back into the primal mud with scarcely a cry. But who builds in stone seeks to alter the structure of the universe, and so it was with these masons, however primitive their works may seem to us. The following evening, as they rode up onto the western rim, they lost one of the mules. It went skittering off down the canyon wall, with the contents of the panniers exploding soundlessly in the hot, dry air, and it fell through sunlight and through shade, turning in that lonely void until it fell from sight into a sink of cold blue space that absolved it forever of memory in the minds of any living thing that was. Glanton sat his horse and studied the adamantine deep beneath him. A raven had set forth from the cliffs far below to wheel and croak. In the acute light, the sheer stone wall wore strange contours, and the horsemen on their promontory seemed very small even to themselves. Glanton looked upward, briefly, as if there were anything to ascertain in that perfect china sky, and then he chucked up his horse and they rode on.